Aron Ralston had planned a mountaineering trip with friends. When it was canceled, he decided to go alone, a decision he would soon regret. Normally, Aron would leave his roommates a detailed itinerary. This time, he left only a single word: Utah. On April 24, 2003, Aron left Aspen and drove west. He had no real plan. He ended up in Canyonlands National Park. The park was vast, covering 500 square miles of desert. Aron planned a 5-day journey through Blue John and Horseshoe Canyons. Friday night, he camped in his truck, far from civilization. Saturday morning, he woke to the beauty of the Canyonlands. He rode his bike into the park, planning to return in a few hours. He didn't bring all his supplies. He wanted to see Blue John Canyon, a slot canyon, 20 miles from his camp. Aron biked there and locked up his bike. He ran into 2 women and chatted with them. They invited him for lunch. He declined. He wanted to explore the canyon. Aron had loved mountain climbing since childhood. In 2002, he quit his job as a mechanical engineer to climb full-time. He moved to Aspen, worked at a retail store, and surrounded himself with people who valued the outdoors. He aimed to climb all of Colorado's 14ers alone and in winter. With a 25-pound pack, Aron wore running shoes, wool socks, a t-shirt, and bike shorts. By 2:30 p.m., he was 7 miles deep at the top of a narrow slot above a 65-foot rappel known as Big Drop. The canyon walls rose steeply. He maneuvered down a 10-foot dry fall. There was no turning back. The canyon narrowed to a 4-foot wide chasm. At 2:41 p.m., he faced another drop-off, this one 11 or 12 feet high. Below the ledge, a boulder the size of a bus tire was wedged in the canyon. If he could step onto it, he could dangle off and take a short fall to the canyon floor. Aron tested the stability of a boulder below the ledge. It seemed solid. He lowered himself onto it, but as he hung from his arms, the boulder shifted. In an instant, the rock dropped, smashing his left hand. Aron yanked his arm back, but the boulder crushed his right hand next. The rock slid further, tearing the skin from his forearm. Agony shot through him as he grimaced and growled, desperately trying to free his arm. He shoved against the boulder, heaving, pushing with his left hand, lifting with his knees. The boulder did not budge. Sweat poured down his face. He wiped his forehead. Needing water, he sucked on his camelback hose but found it empty. He still had a full Nalgene bottle but couldn't get it from his trapped arm. He maneuvered it off his left shoulder, pulled it to his feet, and drank. He realized he had consumed a third of his supply. He needed to think. His right hand was gray and twisted. There was no feeling in it. His hand was crushed and dying. He estimated he had until Monday night. In his pack, he had a CD player, CDs, extra batteries, a camcorder, a camera, a headlamp, and a multi-tool. There was climbing rope, a harness, and some rappelling gear. His thoughts turned to escape. He could try to excavate the rock around his hand, rig ropes to lift the boulder, or amputate his arm. He chose the first option and drew out his multi-tool. His initial attempt to cut into the boulder barely scuffed the surface. He pressed harder but only indented his finger. He stabbed at the rock. Nothing. By 8 p.m., stress turned to pessimism. Without water, without a pick, without a rigging system, there was only one option left. He would have to cut off his arm. The idea filled him with dread. This was madness. He knew he couldn't saw through his arm bones with the multi-tool. He continued picking at the boulder. The sound of his knife tapping the rock was pitiful. Darkness crept in. He pecked at the rock rhythmically. Time slipped by. By midnight, fatigue had set in, but sleep was impossible. The night's chill urged him to keep moving for warmth. When he dozed, his weight tugged on his wrist, waking him in agony. He decided to conserve energy by constructing a seat. Getting into his harness was easy. The hard part was getting a piece of climbing gear secured above him. After several failed attempts, a lucky throw lodged the carabiner in a crack. Relief washed over him. He adjusted the knots and leaned back, taking weight off his legs. But the harness soon restricted blood flow, forcing him to alternate between standing and sitting. In the coldest hours before dawn, he resumed hacking at the boulder. Just after 8, a large raven flew overhead, screeching. Bright daylight filled the canyon. He had survived the night. As the second day began, Aron wondered about kidney failure. It would be a rough way to die. Hypothermia seemed preferable, but the night hadn't been cold enough. Maybe a flash flood. No, he was ready for action. He needed a better anchor for a rigging system. A small horn 6 feet overhead seemed promising, but his attempts to catch it with webbing repeatedly failed. Finally, a well-aimed throw succeeded. He looped a metal rappel ring over the webbing. 2 hours later, the anchor was set. He cut 30 feet of climbing rope, looped one end around the boulder, and threaded the other end through the rappel ring. He yanked on the rope. Nothing moved, but at least the anchor held. Good work, Aron. Now he just needed to move the boulder. He worked to set up an anchor that he could use for the rope. The process took 2 hours, but he managed it. Then he cut 30 feet of rope and tied it around the rock and added methods to gain more lift. But despite it all, the rock refused to move. Panting and sweating, he glanced at his watch. It was after 1 o'clock. Distant voices echoed in the canyon, causing his heart to leap. He shouted for help, his voice trembling with desperation. The echoes faded, leaving him with only the pounding of his heart. Hopes shattered. He realized he was alone. The noises resolved into the scratchy sounds of a kangaroo rat in its nest. By 2 p.m., he seriously contemplated amputation. Laying out his gear, he considered each item's potential use in surgery. His biggest concerns were finding a suitable cutting tool and a tourniquet to prevent bleeding out. The multi-tool's 1.5-inch blade was sharper than the 3-inch one. He decided to use the longer blade for chipping at the rock and preserve the shorter one for potential surgery. Yet he instinctively knew he couldn't hack through bone without a saw. The idea of cutting through the softer cartilage of his elbow joint never crossed his mind. He turned to the tourniquet. Experimenting with the hose from his empty camelback, he cut the tubing free and tied it around his upper forearm. The plastic was too stiff to cinch down. He tried purple webbing, managing a double knot, but the loops were too loose. Clipping his last unused carabiner through the loops, he twisted it twice. The webbing pressed into his forearm, making the skin near his wrist grow pale. The makeshift medical setup brought him a subtle sense of satisfaction. Despite his optimism, he knew amputation wasn't feasible without a way to cut through bone. He wondered if he had the courage to go through with it if necessary. Testing himself, he held the shorter blade to his skin, poking between the tendons and veins. The sight repulsed him. A wave of self-reproach hit him. What was he doing? Slicing his wrist would be suicide. He imagined his blood spilling, his flesh torn and dangling, and his body lifeless. Setting down the knife, he retched. No expectation had prepared him for the tormenting anxiety of a slow death. Would it come tonight in the cold, tomorrow from dehydration, or the next day from heart failure? Every hour was a struggle. By 9 p.m., night filled the sky. Time swelled, his agony expanding with it. He fell into a wormhole of excruciating pain, only to return to consciousness. On the third day, Monday, April 28th, at 7 a.m., he still hadn't given amputation a full chance. He realized he needed a better tourniquet. The neoprene tubing insulation from his camelback seemed perfect. Retrieving it from his pack, he wrapped it twice around his forearm, tied it tightly, and twisted a carabiner 6 times. The pain from the clamping pleased him. He took the multi-tool, opening the long blade, and pressed it against his forearm. Surprisingly, nothing happened. He pressed harder, but the blade wouldn't cut his skin. Frustration grew with each attempt until he gave up, cursing the ineffectiveness of the blade. At 3:35 p.m., Aron Ralston felt the need to urinate. He held it in, transferring the contents of his bladder into his empty camelback, knowing he would need it later. By 6:30 p.m., he felt a call to pray. He closed his left hand into a loose fist, shut his eyes, and lowered his forehead onto it. He prayed for guidance. None came. He even called on the devil, offering his arm, his soul, anything for rescue. Silence was his answer. On the fourth day, Tuesday, April 29th at 5 a.m., the cycles continued. Darkness, cold, stars, space, shivering. He had less than 3 ounces of water left. As he unscrewed the lid of the bottle, it snagged on his harness and spilled. The precious liquid darkened his shorts, turning the red dust to mud. His morale took a heavy hit. At 7:58 a.m., he noticed his knife. There was a reason he brought it. He tied a purple Prusik loop around his right biceps, preparing a tourniquet. He unfolded the shorter blade, closed the handle, and grasped it in his fist. He raised the tool above his right arm and thrust the blade down, burying it in his flesh. "Holy crap, Aron," he said aloud, astonished. His vision warped. Yesterday, breaking the skin seemed impossible, but now he did it. He wiggled the tool, feeling it knock against his forearm bone. He couldn't cut through the bone. Sweating from adrenaline, he picked up his water bottle. Tilting it, he savored each drop. The last drops were gone. On the 5th day, Wednesday, April 30th at 3 a.m., he escaped into trances, finding them more comfortable than the brutal night. Returning to consciousness felt like entering hell. By 9 a.m., he tallied the hours. 96 hours of sleep deprivation, 90 hours trapped, 29 hours sipping urine, 25 hours without fresh water. No emotion, just acknowledgement. At 2 p.m., he recorded with his camcorder. He talked about where he wanted his remains scattered. Looking into the lens, he bid a final adieu, urging his loved ones to bring love, peace, and happiness into the world. Somewhere deep in his mind, Aron knew he would not survive another night in Blue John Canyon. The day had been cool. The night would be the worst yet. He didn't debate it. If his time was up, then it was up, and a strange lightheartedness filled him. By 11 p.m., the canyon turned into an icebox. The winds were killing. Leaning back in his harness, he slipped into another trance. On day 6, at 9:30 a.m., with 5 days of grit pasted to his contact lenses, Aron's eyes hurt with every blink. Sip after sip of urine had eroded his gums and left his palate raw. He couldn't hold his head upright. He was a zombie, miserable, watching another hour pass by. He had nothing to do, no life, no hint that the stillness would break. But he could make it break. He could smash the boulder with the rock again. He began clearing particles from his trapped hand with his knife, using the dulled blade like a brush. Sweeping the grit off his thumb, he accidentally gouged himself, ripping away a thin piece of decayed flesh. He already knew his hand was decomposing, but now he saw how quickly the rot had advanced. The smell was faint, but unpleasant. In a fit of fury, he tried to yank his arm out from under the sandstone handcuff. He thrashed, screaming in pure hate, losing his composure. Suddenly, he felt his arm bend unnaturally. An epiphany struck him. If he torqued his arm far enough, he could break his forearm bones. Like bending a 2x4 in a vise, he could bow his arm until it snapped. There was no hesitation. Unclipping from the anchor webbing, he crouched until his buttocks almost touched the stones on the canyon floor. He put his left hand under the boulder and pushed hard, harder until a muted cap gun shot echoed. Scrambling to clear the boulder, he kept his head on straight. Without pause, he humped his body up over the rock. Smearing his shoes against the canyon walls, he pushed with his legs and pulled with his left hand, mustering all his strength, until a second cap gunshot ended his ulna's anticipation. Sweating and euphoric, he touched his right arm. Both bones had splintered above his wrist. Overcome with excitement, Aron deployed the shorter blade, skipping the tourniquet procedure. He braced himself. His arm was rotting. He placed the cutting tip to his wrist between two blue veins. The pain was unimaginable. The process slow. Cutting the nerve ending was horrifying. The strange euphoria of cutting away his rotting arm consumed him. With a final effort, he was no longer attached. He fell down, free at last. Once his arm was gone, he still had to get out of the canyon. He applied a makeshift tourniquet to hold the wound closed. Then, when he went to cast down a rope to the floor below, it slipped, and he almost stranded himself. As the rope slid over the edge, Aron managed to catch it with his foot at the last moment. He had to get out. He secured his harness and rappelled down. Finally, he was free of the ledge that had been his prison for 5 days. Now he was on the canyon floor, liberated from one ordeal but in the midst of another, getting out. He had to hike another 7 miles. The moment he severed his arm, a countdown began. His tourniquet sufficed so far, but he was in danger of losing too much blood. Yet Aron pushed on. Wounded, he scaled the 65-foot canyon wall. On his way, he had a stroke of good fortune. He stumbled into a family of 3 Dutch tourists. They gave him food and water. The mother and son went for help. The father stayed with Aron. As Aron walked with the Dutch tourist, he heard a helicopter. It appeared like a miracle. The helicopter rushed him to an emergency room in Grand Junction. In the hospital, he had 5 surgeries and a life-threatening bone infection. He suffered chronic pain, especially phantom pain, which is where your body still feels as if there's a limb where there isn't one, and you still feel pain from it even though it's not there anymore. This ordeal did not stop Aron from living a full life. He was grateful to survive. Even though he lost his arm, he still participated in outdoor activities. Park officials retrieved his arm. It took 13 park rangers, a winch, and a hydraulic jack to move the boulder. The arm was cremated, and Aron scattered the ashes back in the canyon. In 2004, Aron published a book titled Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which reached number 3 on the New York Times hardcover nonfiction list. In 2005, he completed his goal of climbing all of Colorado's 14ers with a prosthetic arm. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to check out the other great content on our channel. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.